Yes, so we're discussing Alexander's early breathing work. We've all learnt the story of how Alexander developed the technique, the official version. He was building his career as an actor, and he had voice problems that the doctors couldn't help. He realized it was something he was doing. As he was speaking that was creating the problem, he set up mirrors to watch himself, discovered that as he recited, he pulled his neck back, depressed his larynx, and sucked the air in through the mouth in such the way he produced a gasping sound. And then he set about discovering how to stop these patterns, discovering first how to say no to the pulling back of the head, which made a big difference on his throat, and eventually discovering how to direct it forwards and up so that the spine lengthened and widened. And he called this primary control. We've also been told that all this took about 10 years. And I'm sure you've read the very beautiful account of this in Use of the Self. But is it what happened? In the late 1980s and 1990s, various Alexander teachers began digging for archival material that might give more information about how it had all begun and what Alexander was really doing. And they trawled newspapers in Australia and in New Zealand, in the UK, and they went to libraries, and they also dug in all the archival material that was stuck in boxes in Carrington Cellar that he'd been collecting ever since Ashley Place shut down. So he got a lot of stuff that no one had ever looked at. What emerged was the very clear fact that was, for the first 16 years, Alexander was teaching natural breathing and elocution. And it seemed the Alexander technique, in a form we even might begin to recognize, didn't emerge until 1908. So several books were published. Up from Down Under was the first, Rosalind MacLeod. And next up, Jackie Evans did a family history, an amazing biography of the whole Alexander family, and which contained a lot of new material. And then Michael Bloch did the biography of FM, drawing a lot on interviews with Carrington. And then, but also in 1995, Jan Fisher produced articles and lectures. That's the full version. There is a paperback version that's half that size and half the price. And it's well worth getting if you haven't already got it, and reading if you haven't already read it. And it has all the early articles that were found from various places and compiled together, as well as later lectures like the Bedford Lecture. But to my mind, they all sort of play lip service to this problem. And, but really they're trying to interpret that early work in the context of Use of the Self, and that doesn't work. I don't think any of them actually explain the paradox that that in the chapter in Use of the Self on the evolution of the technique, FM only describes the thinking processes that he went through to free his neck. Breathing is discussed as the problem, sucking in the breath, gasping, etc., but there is no mention whatsoever of him working directly with the breathing. That breathing was part of the solution. Changing the manner of breathing was a part of the solution to the problems. So however much we love that Use of the Self story, it's a story. It's not the whole truth. So let's go right back to the beginning of FM's life. And you probably know that he was born premature. He was probably between 30 and 34 weeks, which back in 1869, in the backwoods of Tasmania, was almost certain death. But fortunately, his mother was a midwife and she knew what to do. And when the child couldn't keep breast milk down, she experimented with different milks and she gave him goat's milk, drop by drop by drop, using a fountain pen dropper. And she nursed him round the clock and she brought him through. And aren't we glad she did? All premature babies of that age really struggle to breathe because the lungs are not yet fully developed. The lining of the lung is still too thick, so it's not yet permeable to air properly. It's not elastic. There are too few little air sacs. there's too few airways, the airways are too narrow, there's not enough capillaries, and there's not enough surfactant to make the lung surface stretchy like a soap bubble, so that when you breathe out, the air sacs tend to collapse. So every breath for a newborn is a life or death struggle. And they develop strategies to help them breathe, to help themselves breathe. So what do? They often grunt at the end of an out breath in order to stop the air sacs collapsing. And that depresses, can you see, depresses the larynx. And this then results on nostril flaring on the in-breath. And the woman who's told us all that is called Jennifer Kello. You may have heard of her. She is a nurse working with preterm babies in intensive care, and she's now also an Alexander technique teacher. And she suggests that many preterm babies keep these habits they've developed as tiny babies right into adulthood because they've never experienced a normal breath. The adaptive patterns worked, it's actually helped them survive, so why change it? And this is the only way they know how to breathe. And she suggests this is FM, that he would have been doing these patterns as a tiny baby and probably kept them right through into adulthood, because the problems he outlines in use of the self that he was having are exactly the same as those of preterm babies. And indeed, he had breathing attacks, quite incapacitating breathing attacks, all the way through childhood, and they carried on right to the end of his life, intermittently. So let's do our first experiment of let's play at breathing like a newborn. And you're going to start by grunting at the end of the out breath, and then pull hard to suck in air through your nostrils, because tiny babies don't mouth breathe. And notice what happens. Remember, this is really hard work. You're really having to work at this. Sorry to be doing, but in the interest of science. What happens to the chest? What's happening? Anyone like to tell me what they're doing with the body to do this? Don't be shy.
You're collapsing the chest, aren't we?
Yes, collapsing the chest on the out breath. And then what does the chest do on the in breath? Does it stay collapsed, or does it?
No, it comes back.
It pulls up, doesn't it? And does anyone notice a pulling back of the neck when we do that? Tiny babies often apparently pull their necks back with that. And it's that then stops them feeding, because you can't, if you think about it, you can't swallow with your neck pulled back. And when the nurses try and make them pull their head forward, they go, no, I need to do this to breathe. And that's why they choke and vomit, and it's why a lot of them die, or used to. So, and the nostrils flare, don't they? But are the nostril passages actually opening or closing when that happens? Do we actually open the passageways or close them, do you think, when that happens?
Close.
Yeah, they narrow, don't they? So we're working like hard, but we're working against ourselves. So what we're describing here is clavicular breathing, where the clavicles, which of course are here, are pulling the chest up in order to inflate it. And that's what FM was doing, as he describes in Use of the Self. And we're told it took 10 years, but actually it was only 9 months before he'd sorted his voice problems sufficiently to go on tour reciting. And only a couple of months after that, he had begun teaching, because people came forward and said, will you teach me? Because you sound so good in your reciting, will you show us what you're doing? So he started teaching very early on. And within a year and a half, he was flat out teaching and loving it. So where have I got to? Yes. So pulling the head back was part of the problem, but it was only part of the problem. He needed to sort his breathing. And, if you read his little biography, he describes how he was having breathing attacks in Melbourne, to the point where at one point he had to go to the seaside for 6 months, for 3 months, and his boss told him, you know, just work the hours you can, and he was really struggling with his breath. That was what needed sorting first. And in his first articles, he writes that the first aim of the singer or speaker is the proper production of the voice. And he says all people with defective voices breathe imperfectly. In every case, when I have overcome that difficulty by my special system of breathing, the cure has been effected with comparative ease. I have never known pupils to breathe properly at the beginning of a course of study. They invariably indulge in clavicular breathing instead of the abdominal. So that's what he's working with straight away, is bringing people out of clavicular breathing. And of course, he's working with clergymen with clergyman's throat, and lawyers and singers and speakers, and all sorts of public speakers are a main part of his clients. So let's explore clavicular breathing in a bit more detail. And I want you to watch your shoulders in your screen. So it can really help to line your shoulders up. I'm going to sit so the top of my shoulder is lined up with that table behind me. And then if my shoulders go up and down, I can see it lined up with the table. So if you can sort of, you've got nothing behind you, Doreen, but just sort of have a look. If you watch very carefully, do your shoulders go up and down as you breathe, or do they stay still? I can see various shoulders going up and down. It's very common. Also in Alexander teachers, very common. That's it. Is anybody not using their shoulders? That's Tina, you've done these with me. It's who's using their shoulders? Who's willing to admit it? That's yeah, Omar and Mary, Dorian, yours going up and down a bit. Yeah. Kathy, are yours going up and down? A little bit. Yeah. So now we're going to emphasize it. So whether if your shoulders are going up and down, you can stay with that. But if they're not, you know, let yourself do a little bit of shoulder breathing at this point. So you've got something really quite clear to work with.
Sorry, Penelope, I'm sorry. And just a question.
Yes.
The shoulders go up and down. Isn't that like inevitable? Because when my lungs are full, well, because they go all the way up here, they will push my shoulders up, wouldn't they?
Watch my shoulders. You can see there's widening happening, but the shoulders themselves aren't going up and down. Because if the shoulders go up and down, look what muscles come into play. So just let your shoulders go really quite clearly up and down now. And the sternocleidomastoids are actually pulling up the clavicles, and the scalenes, which you can't see, because they're underneath, they're pulling up the ribs, and they're pulling them all up into the neck. And if you just do that really quite deliberately, just think about what hard work that is. You're actually, these muscles here are lifting the whole rib cage, the whole shoulder girdle, and the weight of the arms and the scapula. They're lifting them all up into the neck. And for us ladies, they're lifting breasts as well, and breasts can be heavy. So there's an awful lot of work going on here, lifting the chest. And these are called the accessory breathing muscles. And it's what people do at, at the end of a race. And I call them the unnecessary breathing muscles, because Alexander and all the early breathing instructors are very clear. We do not want to be doing that, because just check in with where the breath is coming into. If you're doing this, are you breathing into the diaphragm, or are you within the diaphragm? Are you just breathing into the top of the chest? Just have a check what's happening if you just do this clavicular breathing. Is anything happening in the diaphragm?
If I focus my attention to the to this lower part of the diaphragm, and I breathe, then my shoulders don't move anymore.
Yes, that's the one. That's the one. So for the moment, just stay with making the shoulders breathe. We'll come back to what you just discovered. But for the moment, let's explore everything that happens when the shoulders go up and down. Just watch the sternum, the top of the sternum goes up and down. So the whole breastbone is lifting. Now, I want you to hold your larynx and spot what happens to it as the shoulders go up and down. You can actually see my finger moving. Anyone else feeling this? Does anyone feel that their larynx goes down? And the chest goes up, it pulls the larynx down. Anyone noticing that? Can anyone not spot that? And again, everyone okay with that one? Have you got that? You found that, Mary? Yeah? Dorian, have you found that one? Yeah. So now, if you notice that we're hauling the chest up on the in-breath, but is the out-breath controlled, or does it rush out? Is there a little bit of a dropping on the out-breath? What do you think? So can you feel that you might even hold your fingers in front of your nose. Is there quite a rush of air onto the fingers? Would you say? Is that, yeah. So can you hear your own breathing? Is there a little bit of sniffing with this? If I do this, I can hear my in and my out breath if I pay attention. Anyone else hearing that? Yeah. And just try mouth breathe doing this and notice the gasp. It's what you do in the swimming pool if you've been too long underwater. Anyone noticing that one? So these are all the things that Alexander was noticed. Now touch the back of your neck. And again, you might notice your neck pulling back, or because we're good Alexander teachers, you might be keeping it still. But either way, can you notice it stiffen and tighten? I mean, my neck is just not uninvolved here. What do you think? But if I do a real gasp? I'm spotting that? What do you think? What's happening? Is it pulling back? Moving forwards? Mary, Dorian, what do you think? Omar? I mean, we've all been so taught to leave this area alone that Mary?
Penelope, are you going to force the breath every time, or?
Well, for the moment, yes. I mean, remember when Alexander was doing this in Use of the Self, he watched ordinary speech and he couldn't do anything. And then he watched himself declaim, and there it was. So let's actually do that now. Let's declaim, because that will help you see it. So we're going to pretend to be the mayor of a town, because in Alexander's day, one of the reasons that natural elocution elocution lessons were so important was that the population had grown, the churches had grown hugely bigger, the public halls had grown bigger, the law courts had grown bigger, and there was still no PA system. And the clergymen were having to be heard across these vast churches, and they were forcing their voices. So we're going to be the mayor welcoming the entire population into the town hall for a banquet. Come on in, welcome everybody. Come on, do sit down. You've all got place names. Come and find your seats. Have a go. Be a bit mad. Stand up if you want. That's it. And notice what happens to your voice. What are you doing to be heard? Have you lifted your chest? Are you gasping a bit on the in-breath?
Yeah.
Have you pulled your neck back? Have you perhaps tightened
All
your
those
throat?
things.
All those things, yeah. Okay. So, yeah, this is what Alexander was working with. And he observed the many grievous faults exhibited by public and private singers and speakers, such as the pernicious habits of gasping, which offends the ear when taking a breath, raising the shoulders, which offends the eye, pulling the body out of shape when taking high notes, throwing the head back to open the mouth widely, and the falling of the upper chest. And the solution that he offered, this is from 1900 now, was a course of breathing gymnastics suitable to each special case. He was already very concerned with working for an individual. He teaches 3 classes of breathing gymnastics, those for the development and control of the muscles used in the full inspiration, exercises which train the muscles used to control the slow relaxation of the lungs in expiration, and exercises which enable the students to take breath quickly through the nostrils. So we're going to look at all 3. Most authors on breathing, and now it's still the same, but back then it was the same, they all focus on taking more in-breath. You know, how can you get the biggest possible in-breath? How can you best fill the chest? And FM's huge discovery was of inhibition. He realized you had to work with the out-breath and then not just take a breath. So he doesn't reveal his method until 1908, when he writes, "If one wishes to correct the pupil's errors in breathing, the first thing to do is tell him not to breathe, simply because his mental conception of breathing is sucking in air. It is his habit of a life. Tell him, therefore, not to breathe, but to enable him to obtain those mechanical advantages which give atmospheric pressure its opportunity," which is a weird sentence, which really means if you get the body in the right shape, the air will just rush in. I wish he'd just say simple things like that, but he never does. So let's play with that. I want you to stand up and place one hand, just spotlight myself for a minute. Place one hand on your chest and the other on your belly. And just look out, because if we focus on breathing, then we get over involved with it. So just look out and see your room and find spatial awareness. And just let the breath flow in and out. It's just like you're sitting on the shore of the ocean, watching the waves come in and out. There's nothing you can do to change those waves. You're just aware with your hands of whether your chest is rising and falling, whether your belly's going in and out. You might notice your back widening or not. You might notice your ribs widening or not. Just stay with it. And let yourself be aware of it without any interfering. And now, at the end of the next out-breath, just wait. Don't breathe in. Just wait and 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 wait. And when the in-breath finally happens, you might notice that it really wants to fill the ribs, diaphragm, middle back, lower back. Let the air out again and again, just wait. Because clavicular breathing is a reactive breath. So we're stopping that happening. We're saying no to that. We're taking the energy out of here, putting it down here. Like Omar said earlier, he has to focus his lower ribs, and then that's where the breath happens from. So just let yourself focus the lower ribs, the abdomen. Take the chest, invite this not to work. Invite the ribs and the abdomen to work. And notice if then you can start finding that springy in-breath. If you just wait, there comes a moment where the body takes over and it says, okay, if she's not breathing, I'll breathe. And it goes, and then you get a lovely springy elastic breath. And you might notice that it's not just one bit expanding, but that it's expanding all the way round. And there is a certain amount of top to bottom as well, but it's forwards and back and sideways. The whole thing is expanding in one go. Alexander's name for this in 1900 was full chest breathing. So hands up if you're finding that springy in-breath. Kathy, yes. Omar, yes. Tina, you okay there with it? Yeah, I've done this with me before. Mary, how are you doing on this one? Yeah, and Doreen's disappeared, so I trust that Doreen's found it too. So you might notice that the diaphragm and the floating ribs have come more into play in an easy and spontaneous in-breath, and I call this the springy in-breath. Elasticity was a very important concept early on, and here we've really got an elastic in-breath. And you might also be aware of the back widening as you do this. It just, and you don't have to widen your back, it just does widen. So now let's explore the out-breath. And again, we're going to hold the belly and the chest with the hands, and I'll just spotlight myself again. And what we're going to do first is hold the belly and the chest. And if you do a whispered R, but I want you to let your chest collapse. It looks horrible, but notice, does your belly do anything? Mine doesn't do anything. Some people notice that their bellies really pull in. So just notice which yours are doing. Whether it's doing nothing or whether it's pulling in. And notice that whether the air is quite sustained as it comes out, if you let the chest drop, or whether it just runs out. And you sustain it. If the chest drops, the air probably rushes out. See what you notice. And now you're not going to let the chest descend even 1 millimeter. So we let that springy in-breath happen. And then keep the chest high. And notice what the belly does. Springy in-breath. And I don't know whether you can see, my belly is just very gently drawing back. So it's very different from a pull-in that it might have been doing before. It's just a very gentle drawing back, and it's working in antagonistic action to the top of the chest. That is, the top of the chest stays high, the belly muscles just are drawn into play, and that actually is then supporting the voice. So let's then try another whispered R. You notice that you can actually sustain it a lot longer. Because the column of air is now supported. But if you don't work so long at it, you can now release to the springy in-breath, and now you get a very fast expansion of the back. See if you can find that. So we get the springy in-breath, the supported out-breath. Don't let that drop. And now you might notice a very fast in-breath, and notice whether you can hear it or whether actually it's flowing very smoothly through the nostrils. And notice whether it's widening the back of the chest. And Alexander called this keeping the organization of the out-breath, because he said, if you drop the chest, you disorganize the out-breath. And then you can't breathe in without a whole sort of having to lift the chest up again. Whereas if you keep the chest high, you're keeping the organization of the musculature so that you can then go straight to the in-breath. And it becomes very easy. So how are you getting on? And this natural expansion, Alexander called a primary movement. And again, this is something that these other authors have misunderstood. They thought by saying primary movement, he's talking about lengthening the head, neck, back up. He's not. The primary movement is this primary movement that just happens, that organizes the torso. And it just happens for us. If we're organized right, this primary movement will come into play. So it is like a primary control, but it's organizing the torso rather than the spine. What are you aware of? Anyone willing to share what's happening? Mary.
Penelope, when I place my hand so that it's above my navel rather than below it,
Yeah.
I can detect much more of what's happening here. Maybe it's just me and my muscles, but it's very difficult for me to feel. I can sense it internally, but I cannot sense it with my hand. Whereas I
Right.
can sense it with my hand here and
Yeah.
internally.
Splendid. Okay, go for it. Yeah, because it's all doing the same thing, isn't it? I mean, there's two ways that singers teach support. I mean, one is to draw that in very fast, and the other is to draw that in very fast. And you don't have to do all that, do you? It just happens. Is that what you're finding?
Yes, yeah, that's what I find. It's just happening, but I can feel it more with my hand up here than down here. Yeah.
Fine. Perfect. Yes. And what's then happening with your with your shoulders and your nostrils?
They can stay uninvolved. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Brilliant. Lovely. Yeah. Omar, are you finding this all right?
Yes, it's quite interesting because I feel everything, not just here, but also my back and my legs, and it's kind of brings an awareness of the whole body, really.
That's lovely. Yes. Yes. And there's I think it's Alexander who writes following Koffler that a good in-breath actually involves all the muscles coming into play all together. And, you know, again, the abdominal breathing is you fill the bottom of the chair, the belly with breath, and then you fill the middle, and then finally you fill the top, as if breathing was like pouring water into a glass. First you fill the bottom, then you fill the middle, then you fill the top. That's not how air works. That's how liquids work, but it's not how air works. Air just goes into everything at once, and that's what you're feeling, I guess, Emma, is it? That everything is filling in one go. Yeah. And we usually don't get that. Kathy, you doing all right? You're muted.
Yes, obviously I have the very definitely dropping my chest. I was a lot of focus on the in breath, I would say, or the out breath maybe. So my chest was definitely relaxing.
Yeah, and that's your habit.
Yeah, on the out breath. It was very clear.
Yeah. So what's it like? Sorry.
Really wonderful, so wide open.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very
It's very different, isn't it, to keep the chest up? Yeah. And I mean, this has been my habit for years because I was so shy for so long, and still I can. There's, even though nobody would ever guess I'm shy anymore, and I've mostly forgotten it, but it's that deep habit is still there to pull down there, and actually to come up it's just amazing. To just shed those sort of "don't look at me" patterns, you know. Yeah, so I think this is amazing. So, Tina, you doing all right there? Yeah. So, Dorian, how are you doing?
Yeah, I liked the part about the back widening. You know, totally forgot about that. Yes.
Alexander actually said to Trevelyan, "A man hasn't lived till he has widened his back." That's quite a statement. You know, he didn't say a man hasn't lived till he's freed his neck. I mean, what would you say? Till he's widened his back. I mean, it must have been, if he'd had that cramped preterm baby in his back all those years, to widen his back must have been such a relief. So, you know, this primary movement of the back, that preceded primary control, to me makes a lot of sense. It wasn't until 1925 that he actually defined primary control. So it was a long time later. This was what he was working with, and actually working all his life, but he somehow got denied it, but I'll talk about that. So let's look at the nostril breathing. The early authors that Alexander read, and I think to some extent learnt from, none of them really believe it's possible to nostril breathe all the time, even in a full, and especially in full performance. They knew mouth breathing was a bad idea. It creates gasping. It does all sorts of injuries to the throat, but they didn't believe it was possible. And I suspect FN set out to show that it was. And he emphasized that sniffing and gasping is simply due to a lack of control over and improper use of the mechanism governing the correct contraction and expansion of the thorax and the dilatation of the alar nasi. Why he calls it nostrils the alar nasi, I don't know. So it's the reorganizing of the torso that makes a difference. And he writes, the proper expansion of the chest as a primary movement causes the alar nasi to be dilated and the lungs to be instantly filled by atmospheric pressure. So hold the top of your nose gently and just sniff the air in through your nostrils using clavicular breathing. And again, do you notice that the passageways contract? Actually, you believe you're sucking air in, but actually it squeezes. I'm very aware that it squeezes the passageways together. Is everyone aware of that? Yeah, is that clear? Yeah. So now keep your breastbone down. Don't let the breastbone come up. Keep the breastbone down and wait at the bottom of the out breath, like we've been doing, and let the spontaneous in-breath happen. And breathe out without letting the chest collapse, and let that spontaneous in-breath happen in the back. And you may feel quite round-shouldered. If you're used to doing a little bit of chest lifting, it may feel very strange to let the breath go into the back rather than the front. And now, is there any sound in your nostrils? Or is the air somehow, I sort of feel the air flows in and out like silk at this point. What are you aware of? And any sound just disappears. The nostrils are open. I think there is a bit of flaring at the very base of the nostrils. Just the opening here, rather than a sort of pulling up of the whole thing. Alexander used to do. Go on, Omar.
Yeah, I was just thinking with the out breath and then waiting and then breathing from here. The air comes in much more slowly in the nostrils, so that doesn't cause the the pinching. I don't know, because the first one I was kind of breathing in kind of strongly, and that kind of squeezes here. But if I breathe in slowly, for some reason, it just doesn't do that.
Yes, that's right. What you might discover one day and go, wow, and it took me a long time to find it, is this in-breath that just goes and actually happens incredibly fast and completely silently. And that's what Alexander is actually after finding. So I'll leave that one with you. Just keep playing. But for me, it's all to do with letting the chest, the back of the chest expand somehow, that just gives this very different in-breath that just goes, and the chest will fill in an infinitesimal part of a second. I think he writes something like that somewhere. But I can't always find that by any means. It comes and goes for me, but I'm working on it. How's everyone else doing? Sorry.
I noticed that when I suck air in through my nose, there's all this extra movement in my throat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know, it's like, I think it's my tongue doing something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I haven't focused the tongue today, but Alexander talks about the larynx and the tongue and the lips and the jaw all very much going together. They all get a bit involved. And whereas when this in-breath just happens in the chest, this area is uninvolved. So that's where we're going next. Because Alexander then writes about keeping a good vocal tone. Chest sinking during the act of singing has another serious aspect. While vocalizing chest tones, the vibrations of the vocal ligaments cause the air column in the windpipe to vibrate, which renders the tones fuller and richer. If the windpipe can rest against a solid chest wall, then the tones will be rounder. If the chest is not kept firm, the windpipe loses its support, becomes unsteady, and the tone will sound uncertain and lacking in fullness. So I've just demonstrated that as I read it out. And just try speaking as you allow the chest to drop and notice what happens to your voice. Notice how disorganized it goes, how de-energized it goes, and it sort of starts to croak and it goes down. It's a bit yucky. And a lot of us actually go too long on the out-breath. We speak too long a sentence. Anyone like to comment on what that's like? What's that feel like to speak too long on the out breath, to let the chest drop? Anyone want to comment? Or does it just feel normal? Which you probably would have done to me years ago.
What's wrong with speaking too long on the out breath?
Okay, let's do the opposite. So this time we're going to keep the chest high. And as you talk this time, just keep the chest high. And the minute you feel that the chest has to drop in order to, if I keep talking, then I'm now struggling to actually get enough air under the chest, and it's all going. And that's where I actually need to breathe quicker. I had a therapist years ago when I was 30 years ago at this point. And as I was telling her my sad tale for the week, she would be going, and breathe, and breathe, and breathe, because she was obviously very aware of me speaking too long on the out-breath. What do you notice, Doreen? So keeping the chest high.
Yeah, I wonder, is it, I suppose if you do have a long note or a long sentence, that if you're to keep the chest raised, then there's going to be extra tension to keep it raised?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, because you're a singer, I knew you're a dancer. Are you a singer as well?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So if I'm going to sing a long note, I can either push it to keep that tone going. I'm keeping it coming from my feet. So the first time I was forcing it to keep it, the second time I was keeping it from my feet. Does that make sense? So I'm not forcing anything, but I'm keeping the chest up and listening for that moment Now, if I had got another 2 bars to make, I could have produced it, but I'd then do a gasp before the next sentence, before the next phrase, and it would throw me out. And I think the more one works with this, the more one builds those long phrases. But it's learning to work with it in this keeping the chest up elastic way that's bringing in the natural support, and watching for the ways in which we're squeezing the air out and supporting it with these false means. What does that sound like, Doreen?
So I think what you're saying is the longer the note, the more likely you are to gasp.
Yes, yes. And I mean, this is why building up long notes as a singer takes a long time. You know, I think people don't go to it overnight, do they? They have to build up the sustained muscle tone so that the muscle tone is a tensegrity figure. I mean, everybody knows one of these, that we're not just, you know, squeezing and pushing and disorganizing it to support that air. Do you know what I'm saying there? That what we're looking for is, just like Omar was aware of the whole musculature working on the in-breath, so we want the whole musculature working in a sustained way on the out-breath, rather than using bits and bobs of it to, you know, squeeze in and make things happen. So to start with, certainly what I did was just work within the limit of my musculature, and to start with, take quite short sentences, so that I was making sure that that natural support for the resonant voice was there. And then gradually with time, that's lengthened out. And I'm more aware of it singing, because I think with the singing, you can maintain the longer note. But my old habit as someone with ME would have been to speak from this place and let everything get very disorganized. And, you know, that was part of my exhaustion and my fatigue. You know, it was part and parcel of the picture. Anyone want to comment on all that? I'm throwing a lot at you here. So notice that this new way is taking the strain off the throat and bringing it back to the chest. So just be the mayor of the town again, and notice if you do that forced way, come on in. But my voice has gone up in pitch, and I'm now controlling the air out through my voice box. Just try that again. Come on. That's where we're closing. Rather than using the chest now isn't doing anything. Can you feel that the strain is all being held in the throat? And this is why Alexander, his diagnosis was actually clergyman's throat. That's what he was technically suffering from. And as I say, clergyman's throat was then trying to reach all these big audiences with great rousing sermons, no doubt, telling them about hellfire. Now let's come back to, so we're now going to be the mayor, but just come back to letting the chest come in and out, keeping the chest high, letting the lungs flow in and out naturally. The abdominal tone is coming into play. And when you're ready, invite your people in. Come on in. Hello now, come on. You're all very, very welcome. And see if you can notice that the tone is now held from the chest. It's the chest that's now controlling the expiration of air and not the throat. And you don't have to worry about reaching the back of the hall for the moment. Or if you know how to let it come from your feet, that will help. Welcome, welcome. There's a lovely banquet here. Come on in. You've all got place settings. You might notice that that breath just wants to fill easily. You're not now gasping and sniffing. And you might also notice that your voice has come down to what Alexander calls the mid-tones. Come on, come on, come on, actually raises the pitch. Whereas hello, come on in. And it's more of a mid-tone voice. And he talks a lot about finding the mid-tone. And again, it's not, if we work from the abdomen, we come into these very bass notes. But he's interested in this. When it's really supported from the chest, we come into this middle tone, which is actually a very comfortable and a very relaxed way of speaking. And I'm really working on trying to get that happening in me at the moment. Anyone like to comment? How are you doing? Kathy?
Unmute there. Yeah, it's really big for me because I was singing in a choir over Easter, and I can never. I always have to take a breath where I shouldn't. So I was just kind of practicing there, and it was very different.
Lovely. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the other one there is one's habit of trying to get the breath in and hold it, whereas you really can just come from this very easy breath and still do an incredibly long note when one gets this going. But it's such a habit to break, of preparing to speak and tensing everything. But it's not needed, is it? I don't know if you noticed that as well, Kathy.
Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else want to comment?
I find this breathing really very calming.
Calming. It is calming. Yeah.
It's really calming, yeah.
Yes, it genuinely is calming, because this actually directly goes to our panic centers. Whereas the breathing we're doing now actually brings us into the parasympathetic, into the calming. So it's profound, actually.
Yeah, and there is a feeling of expansion too. That's
yes. Yeah, it just lets the whole body go, oh wow, I'm home. It's yeah. Anyone else like to comment? Anyone finding that mid-tone voice? That place where the speech just somehow happens in a very easy place?
What I notice most is the inhalation is just instant, it just is in a microsecond. And so you can keep talking, and then it's just there, and then the breath just comes in, and you can keep on talking again. It's just like, and it's all coming from.
So there's an advantage. You can talk forever, Mary. Yes, it's amazing, isn't it? How I mean, this is what actors, Anna Dora was the first one really to discover that very fast in-breath, and of course she teaches the acting. So she was the one who really showed me it was possible, because I'd been thinking, well, he writes that, but is it really possible? And she said, yes, it is. So and she uses it in her acting now.
You don't even notice the volume of it,
Yeah, and it's the support for the breath that actually reaches to the back of the hall. as a student, I went to hear Janet Baker sing, and she was one of the great opera singers. And I was sitting right at the back, and she was singing pianissimo, and I could hear absolutely every note. It was amazing. It's like you wouldn't, but it's the projection of it and the support for it. And it doesn't matter what the volume is, it reaches. It's extraordinary.
So what is it that causes the quick, easy inhale?
It's just the I mean, as Alexander says it's the organization of the musculature, that it's just a mechanism that just wants to happen. You know, once you set the torso up, you haven't let it drop, so you haven't let it disorganize, and then it will just, you know, if you have a vacuum and you open the door to a vacuum, the air just will rush in, won't it?
So
and if it just rushes in, the whole thing just will fill.
Not shoulder breathing.
No, absolutely. So can you see why I'm sort of saying, and why Alexander says shoulder breathing is really bad news? Because it's disorganizing the whole system, and it's not allowing the proper mechanisms to come into play.
And you don't have to get to the end of the breath for the vacuum effect to work. No,
you don't. No, because I mean, you take a smaller breath, the whole thing just goes and fills. So it's not a matter of going sort of bottom, middle, top, you know, like they teach in yoga, which is not what the ancient yogis were teaching. It's a modern invention. It's a misunderstanding, because I'm sure the ancient yogis knew this one. You know, it's like taking light into a cave. Doesn't matter how many thousands of years that cave has been dark, the light will just fill the cave. And it's the same with breath. If you open the vacuum, the lung will just go, and it can expand very fast. I wouldn't have believed it possible until I experienced it. So one can ask the question, why did we not all learn this? You know, initially Alexander thought, and we're talking back sort of 1905, 1906 at this point, he thought that the ills of civilization, with their poor living conditions, stresses, and there was awful air pollution at that time because it was all coal-fired. And Melbourne, London, they'd all got awful smogs. And that created the conditions for poor breathing. And he thought it was the poor breathing that then distorted people's use and their posture. And that, in a sense, was true for him, wasn't he? He'd been, you know, breathing as a premature, that it was that struggle for breath that had distorted his use. And if he was struggling for breath in Melbourne and Sydney, the same thing would have happened. Well, Melbourne particularly. So, but in 1909, he reversed the causality of that. He said, someone who breathes poorly does so as a consequence of poor use. And he didn't use the term poor use then. Someone who breathes well is able to breathe well because his use is good. And so he reasons, if you take someone who breathes poorly and you change their physical use so that they look like the person who breathes well, then they will breathe as well as the person who already breathed well, if you see what I'm saying. In other words, all you've got to do to help somebody's breathing is get their use right, and the breathing will look after itself. And so that, and he wrote, the process by which this is achieved is simply a readjustment of the parts of the body by a new and correct use of the muscular mechanisms through the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness, by which he means thinking. And he concludes, given the perfect coordination of all the parts as acquired by my system, breathing is a subordinate operation which will perform itself. And that's where he stopped teaching breathing directly. He changed the causality, and that was the end of him teaching people how to breathe. And I think it's a huge pity, because that's what we learned, isn't it? All you've got to do is look after everything else, and breathing will look after itself. But look at us, we were all shoulder breathing, you know, and I was before I started, and I had a heck of a job to come out of these poor use patterns. It took me months and months and months of work, and indeed years, really. And I'm still working on it. because, you know, I had really difficult breathing for many years. And, you know, at the point at which I did my first breathing workshop, which was with John Hunter in, when was it? My daughter was 3. So 92, 95. It was actually, yeah, it was 1995. And I didn't know how John had got the information that he got to teach me this long out breath, wait, let the in breath come in. And I actually rang him up a few months ago. I'd asked him over the years, and he's very coy, is John. He doesn't give you straight answers. And I tried again a few months ago. I rang him up and I said, John, where did you get that breathing method? And he said, what year was it? And I said, 1995. He said, I'd been reading articles and lectures. So he had actually read articles and lectures, recreated it, and taught it to me and others. And in fact, I did a workshop round about the same time with Paul Burge. And he also had done the same thing. And both of them at that point had shown me my middle voice and said, this is your true voice. And I thought, why are they saying this? And they both, I haven't asked Paul. Paul's died now, so I can't ask him. But I bet he'd done the same. He'd read articles and lectures. We need to add this back in, because I think there's not just one primary control, there's 2. In fact, there's several, as anyone who's read my book. But there's 2 primary ones that Alexander discovered. And the first one is this primary control of the chest that he called the primary movement. And that is what gives us the width and the strength of the back. And then the head, neck, back one that he actually then named primary control, that gives us the length of the spine. And unless you really have both, you don't have the full picture. But, you know, in those days, you just looked for one answer, whereas nowadays you look for in science, you look for a multitude of answers that network. So modern science thinking is very different, because we're happy with there not just being one cause, but a variety of causes that then all network together. And this, to me, is what the body's actually doing. It's working from here. It's working from here. There's also another one in the belly, and the sacrum, the pelvic area, has another one. And then there's, you know, others that can come in as well. The eyes is another one. And they all network together. So to me, we have to bring this direct teaching of breathing back in. It makes such a difference to pupils. So what do you think? Anyone like to comment on all that? Little soapbox on my part. Do you work with breathing? It's so simple to teach somebody. You know, breathe out, wait, let it happen. And it can change everything for people. And I wish to God somebody had done that with me at the beginning of my Alexander work. You know, they all saw I was struggling with breathing and voice, and nobody gave me any help, including Vivian Mackey, who I worked with for a year. And she apparently teaches voice, but she never taught me. You know, I was just a pupil. You don't teach pupils this stuff. It was a really strange mentality. I'm quite angry about it. Anyone else have a story like that? I mean, things have changed. I mean, I think there's more breathing work come in since Jessica got going, and with her art of breathing, she helped to bring it back in as well. But there's still not enough taught. So we're going to finish up. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you think of all that. So.
It's interesting, this idea of 2 or more primary controls. Because before I listened to your talk, Penelope, I was under the impression that there is one primary control, which is the head-neck relationship, and out of that, as a consequence of that, there is the widening of the back, and the breathing comes in at that stage. So there is kind of a dependency between the 2. But it's interesting to hear your side of it.
Yes. Yes, and of course that's true, but it's also true the other way up, because if you get the breathing working, actually the neck will lengthen up. So you can work it either way up. You know, these networks, you can go in at any point.
That's
so
nice.
it's recognizing that there's other self-organizing mechanisms of the body that you can take as primary. Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else want to?
Exhaler. So if I was to do a whispered ah and stop kind of halfway, pause, and then let the breath come in, would that be a kind of a natural whispered ah, getting out the habit of having a long exhale?
Well, see how far you can go before the system feels strained, because you might be noticing that, I mean, yours might be much longer than mine, I don't know, but there's a point where one starts to struggle to maintain what he calls the column of air in the windpipe, the support for the column of air in the windpipe, if you know what I'm saying by that.
Yeah.
And it's like, stop at that point and breathe in. And if you can find this really fast in-breath, it doesn't matter that you have to stop and take this really fast in-breath. And of course, one can leave the mouth open. And you use the oral seal, don't you? You can take a fast in-breath with the mouth open without breathing through the mouth. So one doesn't have to shut the mouth every time. So play around. I mean, you may not want to do it on stage, but I think it's something to work on as a discipline, to just work with the elasticity of the tissues where they're at, and then you'll find that it will then increase.
Yep.
Yeah, go for it. Tell me what happens. Yeah. Mary, do you want to comment?
That's really good. Yeah, I'm so used to just freeing the neck always. It's difficult to get out of that, to explore a different way. But I agree with you fully. Whatever self-organizing mechanism you're going to latch onto, it doesn't matter. But I suppose because of the old-fashioned primary control, that's what gets my shoulders out of it, and and allows this idea of the instant kind of inhalation that can happen at any stage. If you're talking and talking and talking, the next thing just happens as quickly as that, and you can go on and on and on again.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, at the end of his life, Alexander said, I wish to God I'd never said free the neck. He said they're all obsessed with their necks. And I think we don't, you see, he never defined. I've defined for you the stages that he went through. And it's all there in the early articles. But after that, it never got defined for us. So we know how to do primary control. Let my neck be free, let the head go forward, let that, but nobody said to us, keep the chest up, let the abdomen come slowly in. And there's a few other directions in there that one can bring in. Nobody told us that as a way of inviting this organization of the torso. And so I think this is partly why it was shown to them. Miss Goldie certainly did it to me, but she didn't teach, because she didn't explain it, she couldn't teach me how to teach somebody else. So until I learned it from John, there was no way I could have passed that on. And I think that's what's happened. Alexander worked on his first trainers, but they had no idea how to pass it on because it wasn't ever verbalized. You've got to be able to verbalize something to teach it. So this is what we're getting back to, is being able to verbalize it. And then we can work with all parts of the system. So.
Penelope, when you say keep the chest up, locks me immediately. Keep the chest up instantly.
Yes.
There's muscle.
Yes.
So I can't work with keep the chest up.
No, and actually that's a phrase he never uses. That's a phrase everybody else uses. But he says, don't let the chest drop. Subtle difference, but absolutely key, as you say. Yeah. And that's okay, is it? Don't let the chest drop. Yeah. Thank you for stating the Alexander obvious there. That he's reframed it in the negative. Yeah. Kathy, you okay there?
On mute again. Yes, feels very empowering, to be able to breathe like this.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, the different primary controls. As you said, talk about one. So it's
Lovely.
yeah.
Thank you. Tina, you okay there?
Yeah, my internet kept coming and going, so I didn't get the full benefit, I'm afraid, from the workshop. So I'm just going to have to listen to your recording.
Yes, yes. So I'll send the recording on to you guys, and Margaret Maher asked for it, so I'll send it to her as well. And but otherwise, don't pass it on to everybody, because this is actually a bit of a trial workshop, because it's really a chapter in my book, and which I hope will be finished by the end of the year. Because I'm writing this book on how Alexander really developed the technique, so which will either go down a storm or a lead balloon, we'll see. Yeah, so I hope you'll all buy it when it comes out anyway. So thank you for playing today. That was really good to play with on this and share it. Yeah, it was a good excuse to actually get a chapter in. Yeah. Okay.
Great,
Anyone
Penelope.
else?
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Right you go. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.